Welcome to Falun Dafa Information Center's new show, the Falun Gong Bulletin, where we cover news from China and give our analysis on why it matters to us, even here in the West. Hi, I'm Ben Maloney, Digital Outreach Director for Falun Dafa Information Center.
And I'm Cynthia Sun, researcher at Falun Dafa Information Center.
On today's show, we're going to go over our 5 forecasts for the persecution of Falun Gong in China and what the 2023 could hold. And then we're also going to do a recap of the 2023 International Religious Freedom Summit that Cynthia attended in Washington, D.C., and give you our top 3 takeaways from our experience. Why don't we get it started, Cynthia, and you can talk a little bit about this report, which is Key Trends in 2022, What to Watch For Ahead, which is a report that Falun Dafa Information Center published. It's available online, and it was one that got a lot of attention at the summit as well. Why don't you walk us through the 5 trends for 2023?
The first trend is targeting Falun Gong practitioners as part of censorship efforts surrounding spikes in COVID infections and deaths. The second is high-tech surveillance deployed to monitor and detain Falun Gong practitioners. The third is new international sanctions and imprisonments of CCP officials involved in the persecution of Falun Gong. The fourth trend is the fate of Falun Gong in Hong Kong. And the fifth trend is transnational persecution of Falun Gong practitioners. And so maybe we can go back to the first trend and break each of them down. The first trend really targeting Falun Gong practitioners as part of censorship efforts surrounding the spike in COVID infections and deaths. This actually brings us back to 2020. At least 12 practitioners were detained as part of censorship efforts to suppress the information of COVID-19 going out. And this year, as we know, the lockdowns have lifted and zero COVID policy is no more in China. And so we see a lot more activity surrounding Falun Gong practitioners and uploading information on, jumping the Great Firewall and trying to alert people outside of China to what is actually going on within the borders.
Yeah, right. And it's important for the viewers to understand that the reason Chinese Communist Party is so focused on the Falun Gong practitioners to getting this information out is not just that it's happened historically, but that Falun Gong practitioners have developed software to get around the Great Firewall. They have organized pipelines and information networks out of China. So and they also are the largest number, right, of people persecuted in China. So they cause the biggest quote unquote threat to the truth actually getting out, whatever that truth is around human rights, or in this case, around some of the things actually happening on the ground with COVID. There's a couple examples maybe you could give as well.
So Xuna and 10 other practitioners were detained in early 2020. She was sentenced 8 years for sending information about what Beijing looked like and the lockdowns in China. And Fang Bing, the second practitioner that we feature on Falun Info, is pretty well renowned. He's a YouTuber, actually, that went into Wuhan hospitals. And for a whole week, he documented what the body bags and what was actually going on with all of the COVID infections inside of Wuhan, the hotspot of where COVID actually spread out from. This year, we've seen dozens of reports on Minghui and of practitioners jumping the firewall again, just like they did 3 years prior, to send information out. The targeting of Falun Gong that we expect would be more likely in regions of northeastern China, like Hebei province, Shandong province, Jilin province, and Heilongjiang province. These regions in northeastern China have been historically where the persecution is the harshest, and also where more Falun Gong practitioners are located.
Why is it the harshest in those areas?
Not only the density of Falun Gong practitioners, but also a lot of the security apparatus is also located in northeastern China. And so they just have the, resources, the amount of people to carry out this persecution campaign. And going into the second trend, it's similar high-tech surveillance used to monitor and detain Falun Gong practitioners. We've covered Hikvision alarms in the past episode, but there's an emerging technology called the Health Code app, which was mandatory for all Chinese citizens to have. It marks you as green, orange, or red to indicate if you have been in close contact with COVID-19 individuals, or if you are safe to go out and go to grocery stores, go to your workplace, go to school. This tool was actually used as a suppression tactic. One practitioner reported last year, police threatened to change her health code if she didn't renounce her faith to Falun Gong and sign an oath that she would stop practicing Falun Gong.
Right. It's a good example of, how the Chinese Communist Party, whatever technology they can use is really a repression tool. So ostensibly, it looks like it's some sort of health tool that also, we should note, restricts your movement, right? Restricts if you can go to your job, make money, restricts if kids can go to school, restricts where you can move around. And then the reality is, obviously, the Chinese Communist Party is not using it for health. They're using it as a tool of repression.
Exactly. And so emerging technologies just like this, just like the health code app, the Falun Dafa Information Center will continue to monitor and document the cases. Trend number 3 is new international sanctions of CCP officials involved in the persecution of Falun Gong. In the past few years, the Biden administration has actually sanctioned several perpetrators of the persecution of Falun Gong, top-level CCP officials.
For gross human rights violations.
Rights violations, especially in Sichuan and Fujian. And in 2023, we actually expect, as more cases are documented, that northeastern China, like the perpetrators there, will also, be under sanctions. The 2 people sanctioned by the Biden administration are only a small percentage of the hundreds of perpetrators. Every city, every province has police officers, local officials, neighborhood committees that are involved with the persecution of Falun Gong. And so for the past 24 years, especially in these upcoming years, since the Blinken and the Biden administration has already expressed that they are willing to sanction under Magnitsky Act and others, these human rights violators, it's important to continue to send these lists their way so that they can sanction more in the future. Trend number 4 is the fate of Falun Gong in Hong Kong. Falun Dafa Information Center is especially concerned about the rights and freedoms of the community of Falun Gong practitioners in Hong Kong. Since the adoption of the national security law in 2020, some suspect that, Falun Gong practitioners could be banned or violently persecuted like those in mainland China. And what we've seen is that pro-Beijing officials have issued public calls to ban Falun Gong in public. At least one incident in 2021, authorities fined practitioners for holding an exhibit. And although Falun Gong practitioners have been able to continue practicing their faith, doing meditation in parks and the like, in 2022, there are at least 3 cases at the low levels of judicial court where courts punished attacks on Falun Gong practitioners or information booths and upheld basic rights such as freedom of expression and the display of a Falun Gong banner in public. In 2023, we expect that incidents will continue to happen just like this, but we'll have to see whether the courts continue to uphold these freedoms of belief, freedoms of expression, or if they set the precedent this year that the national security law is actually going to ban Falun Gong. The 5th trend is transnational persecution of Falun Gong, which ties in from earlier. The CCP's persecution of Falun Gong has rarely stayed within the borders of China. Refugees and local practitioners around the world have faced surveillance and harassment, including in Chinatowns and on college campuses. So the most prominent case was in New York last year, where an individual who was suspected to have ties with the CCP and the local consulate in New York went around for a week going to information booths where volunteers would pass out pamphlets of Falun Gong, and he destroyed banners, he destroyed a Bluetooth speaker. It was a targeted, coordinated attack because for that entire week, he went around several locations and repeated the same battery. Right.
And this is something we should note, that it's not just this one individual as a trend. Like we knew that, for instance, in Houston, this used to happen a lot. And then when the consulate famously got shut down in Houston, these incidents suddenly dried up and no longer happened, which helps to kind of prove the point that perhaps there was those relationships, that actually the consulate is the one driving these individuals through whatever means to actually coordinate these attacks.
The center is also concerned about covert tactics to masquerade CCP opinions in the West, such as in newspapers, on social media, and among policy influencers to spread anti-Falun Gong sentiments.
Right, and that's important because that can happen through a variety of ways. Obviously, the most egregious being, somebody physically going to assault a booth, but there's many ways that they can push. The Chinese Communist Party pushes their anti-Falun Gong narratives. Cult label was a very famous one.
Racist.
Yeah, racism. Different aspects. Different political aspects and political labels. So the Chinese Communist Party can push that through any ways, right? Like think tanks or
diplomatic.
Western Western media, opinion pieces, or paid media, or when you read something about that, we would encourage you to look at all sides, and kind of see where the real facts are there. But that's a really good segue. Those top 5 trends again. Our report, which is printed here, is available on the website. We'll link to it below so you can have a better look. But I know that this report was a big topic in the IRF, or International Religious Freedom Summit, which you just went to in Washington, D.C. very recently. Curious if you could tell us a little bit about what is the IRF Summit, what was Falun Dafa Information Center doing there, and how did everything go?
Yeah, the IRF Summit is held annually. This is the 3rd year that it's been held and the 3rd year that we've attended. And it's basically to increase public awareness about religious freedom around the world, and how it's being suppressed, essentially.
Right, and it's just for clarity, there's the largest NGOs are there. There's policymakers, and like I saw Blinken issued a statement, well wishing the IRF. So there's a lot of connection between, the U.S. government and NGOs, and this is like a pretty big deal.
Yeah, there was also the president of the legislative UN from Taiwan was also there.
Okay,
which is one of their top officials as well. So usually Falun Dafa Information Center has a booth with information, such as the latest report. And also this year we featured 3 speakers. The first was our executive director, Levi Browdy, who spoke on a panel about documenting dissent and how Falun Gong community has been able to have these cases from the past 23 years and how to best clarify them to Western people who might not know what's going on inside China.
Especially around forced organ harvesting, is that right?
Exactly, yeah. And we also had 2 other speakers who are actually victims of the persecution, unfortunately. Grace Chen and Simon Zhang personally had experiences being persecuted in China, or their families being persecuted. Those who follow our social media will know that these 2 are at the top of our family rescue initiatives.
Can you tell us a little bit about, for people that aren't as familiar, a little bit about Grace and Simon, just high level, what their stories are for people that don't know?
Grace Chen is a high school student in New York. Her parents were detained in China in 2020, so it's been over 2 years now since she's had any contact with them. They were sentenced to an unknown length of time, and so she was just there to really share her case with people and to find out how best to help them find freedom. Simon Zhang is an architect in New York City. His mother was actually detained this time last year during the Beijing Winter Olympics. During that month, he was advocating. He was trying to find out, how to get her released. After that month, she was actually found to have been killed in police custody from the persecution. Both of their cases were really moving, and they were really they really highlighted how widely this persecution impacts people, even here in America.
Tell us a little bit about what the reception to their stories. I know they were on panels with other victims, but can you tell us a little bit about kind of what they said, or maybe we can play some clips?
Yeah, sure. Grace Chen, she was featured at the youth track, and so with other religious prisoners of conscience. But her testimony was especially moving because she also had experiences growing up in China, being fed propaganda when she was in elementary school, being kidnapped once when she was on her way to kindergarten, leaving to America by herself at the age of 14, and then after a year not being able to have any contact with her parents, like finding out that her parents were detained from a news article. Like, all of that was really shocking to hear because she is so young. She's still in high school. Probably best if you hear it from herself. So we have a clip here to play.
In the fall of 2020, my parents were arrested with 8 other Falun Gong practitioners. When I found out, it was so sudden and shocking, but I wasn't that worried. I just called my mom and dad a few days ago, so I thought they would be okay and call me again soon. 1 week passed, and I still had hope. Then 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks went by. Every time I heard the phone ring, I hoped it was my mom and dad, but I never called. I felt so miserable. Every night I cried in bed. I became quiet at school. I bookmarked every single article about my parents' arrest on my laptop. I felt like now I was all alone in the world.
You just heard from Grace's own words how she was affected by the persecution. You can watch her full speech on faluninfo.tv or on any of our social media. After watching her speak, everyone in the room was in tears. There were other people who also similarly had experiences of persecution, but she was so young, and so they were just applauding her, trying to encourage her, because it's very difficult to come and talk about such a horrific experience. But Grace is also the second generation affected by the persecution, because she was born in 2005, so it was actually years after the persecution had already started. And after she graduates this summer, she'll be unable to go back to her family in China because they're arrested and there's going to be security issues with her going back. We'll do a follow-up episode in the future, maybe with Grace, or if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and we might do a Q&A if she's willing to share her story. As for Simon Zhang, his panel session was with human rights experts such as Nina Shea and Katrina Lantos Sweat. He mainly highlighted the impact of the persecution, as we just said, about his mother, because she had also been detained in forced labor camps several times before her most recent detention last year, in which she passed away. I'll let him explain it in his clip here.
On March 21, 40 days after she was arrested, my mom died. My father demanded an explanation but was only met with indifference. Instead, nearly 50 policemen guarded my mom's body and monitored my parents' apartment. On April 7th, my mom was cremated. My father was forced to give permission after the police threatened they would fire my cousin, who is my father's close nephew, from his government job. They also threatened my father, using photos of me joining Falun Gong events in the United States, telling him that they know everything about what's happening here.
His experience was rather harrowing, but he wishes that, by telling his story, that other practitioners, the millions that are still in China, won't have to face the same thing that he had. You can also watch his full speech on Falun Info TV. I met a lot of incredible people. I'm really grateful for the experience. A lot of congressional members and human rights experts were very interested in Simon and Grace. They were very willing to help. So we have a lot of takeaways from the whole experience, which I'd like to share.
Sure, yeah. Give us some of maybe the highlighted 3 takeaways from some of your learnings and experience at the summit.
So overall, there was a general awareness about the Chinese Communist Party's abuses of human rights and suppression of faith. Overall, there was a lack of awareness of how to deal with it or what to do to stop it, because a lot of people have the conceived notion maybe that, China's so far away that we're unable to do anything about it, or it's the concerns of the people in China and not our concern. But I found a lot of people were willing to listen, and a lot of people were willing to brainstorm together ideas of what to do. And we actually have a lot of ideas. One of them we mentioned earlier was sanctions. We've seen that actually impacts, the perpetrators personally. If you don't know, the sanctions actually prevent the perpetrators and their families from coming to America. If they have any land, property, assets in America, those are seized. Their children are unable to come to school here. And so it really affects them personally. The sanctions, as well as other avenues, like exposing their crimes even, like the simple act of documenting persecution, the crimes that they're trying desperately to cover up. That's also one of the avenues to actually make change. We also had a recommendation this was for mainly the ambassadors and any diplomatic staff who are going to China, to meet with victims of persecution, to meet with people who are affected by the persecution of Falun Gong that are here in America, and because those stories really, I mean, like you heard earlier, those stories really do matter, and it's like people's lives that are at stake here. And the last one was the bills. The United States has yet to pass a bill about forced organ harvesting and
Falun Gong Protection Act.
And the Falun Gong Protection Act. The United Kingdom and Canada have already set a precedent. The UK actually passed 2 bills regarding forced organ harvesting that we've talked about in previous episodes, and those have actually made a rather big impact because it completely stops like the economic trade of medical equipment between like the United Kingdom and China. And it also prevents organ tourism from happening. And then the second takeaway was USERF, which is the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, actually have prisoners of conscience forms that anyone can fill out. So I really wanted to share this with the viewers because anyone can just go onto the website, and if you have a family member abroad that is being persecuted, that you know is detained, and there is some sort of document or evidence of it, USERF is actually looking for help in this regard, and they're requesting that people send them in, because if they're not sent in, then they're not documented. If they're not documented, then legislators and policymakers can't really act on it.
Right. So just so I'm clear, one of the ways that the government, whether they're doing the sanctions or, they're looking at bills, one of the ways that they understand the scope and the individual cases is through this portal that people document cases. Is that right?
Yeah. This is like the number one resource for policymakers to make these decisions into law and to really like consider it as high priority. We'll also have a link for this in the description box below. So please send them in. The third takeaway was really the impact that victim testimony could make, as you just saw with Grace and Simon in our clips before, and also our previous victims that we've brought to the IRF Summit. It really moves people, and it really helps people like humanize and visualize what's really going on inside of China, because there's like a basic understanding that the CCP is a violator of human rights, but how does it really impact the people, the community? Like how, for Grace, like her whole school was indoctrinated by this Falun Gong propaganda, and her teachers would talk about it. Her faculty would talk about it. She was really scared to even say that she was a Falun Gong practitioner because she was worried that her family might be taken away from her, which now we know that they were. And so like just having, I guess, like a space for them to really like tell their stories that they weren't able to in China was really important to remember, because we have all of these statistics in our report. We have, analysis of all these trends, but
it's happening to people.
It's happening to people just like us.
Yeah.
And like, not even in our worst nightmares would we think of all of these like forced organ harvesting, all of these crimes. And so, like what the Falun Dafa Information Center really hopes is that we can bring you more stories in the future, and also that you'll be willing to listen to these stories, because it really makes the difference for them.
Thank you for joining us today for the Falun Gong Bulletin. Until we see you next time for the next episode, feel free to share this clip or this video with your friends and family. Thank you.